Okay, so we are back again this week with another Migrant Women Reality Watch. I'm Adriana, I'm from the European Network of Migrant Women, and today we have a really very special guest joining us from the United States. Her name is Ninotchka Rosca, and she's a Filipina feminist, author, human rights activist, and dissident thinker and journalist. We will give you the opportunity to present yourselves, but we just wanted to give some background to our European viewers. So first of all, Ninotchka was a political prisoner under the then Filipino president Ferdinand Marcos, and she was consequently exiled to Hawaii, which is up to date the only United States state that is located out of North America. But that didn't stop her at all. She went on to found the Affirm organization, which is the largest and only US Filipino women solidarity organization. And she is international spokesman for their Purple campaign against sex trafficking in women. But all of this, Ninotchka will tell us afterwards. Very importantly, or at least for me, Ninotchka was the press secretary for The Hague's International Tribunal on Japan's military slavery during World War II. And this is the same tribunal that ultimately convicted Japan for the creation and the use of what we call comfort women, which Ninotchka will also address after. Apart from that political activism, she is also the author of 2 novels, which are called State of War and Twice Blessed. And she also co-wrote a book with the founder of the Filipino Communist Party. But without taking any more of your time, I would ask you if you could present yourself to our European viewers, because I think that a lot of people here in Europe know you, but some may not. So I'd like to take the opportunity for you to present yourself, tell us about your early life. Basically, who are you and what does your past and present work consist of? Thank you.
Thank you so much, and hello to everybody who is tuned in at the moment. I hope you will find this discussion meaningful and you can relate to it. I am a Pacific Islander. I was born in the Philippines and I grew up in the city of Manila. The Philippines is an archipelago with 7,100 islands. 7,400 islands. They found some more recently. So my maternal family line is traced directly to a Spanish priest who took a 15-year-old India. We were called India in those days. Everybody was an Indio or India. He took my great-grandmother at the age of 15 and had 7 sons by her. She was rumored to be a Babaylan, a priestess. Before the Spaniards came, we had no priests in the Philippines. We had priestesses. Women were considered the link between this world and other dimensions. Now, my paternal line is Chinese, Shanghai, who married a Filipina. So the paternal family line is shorter than my maternal family line. The women in my family were very strong because the paternal family line was an alien line, to the country. So the influence of the female was very strong in our clan. And we were Católicos cerrados, we were very strict Catholics. So children were to be seen but not heard. We had no voice. Okay. My mother went to the university, one of the first women to do so. State University. And my older sister, who is about 20 years older, also went to the university. So we had a very good library in the house. And I was about 6 or 7 years old, and I was told, do not touch the books. Of course, I touched the books. I read all the books. So at the age of 7, I was reading Cervantes in English and teaching myself the language at the same time I was reading. And I consider the book still a major influence on my perspective of the world. So now, because we weren't allowed to speak out, I thought writing, I started writing at the age of 7. Scribble here, scribble. And at the age of 12, I managed to get a piece published. So that was it. My life was set. I wanted to go into physics, but they said, oh no, you're a writer. That's it. So then I went to the university, and one day I was walking around in the College of Arts and Sciences, and I accidentally entered this conference room, and there was a Buddhist monk speaking about Vietnam and the war in Vietnam. So I sat down and I listened, and I said, I do not know anything about this. So I went to the library and started reading on the war in Vietnam, and became very politicized from that point on. And I ended up joining the most radical student organization, and eventually became its president and led the first student strike in the university. I almost got kicked out, of course. But my experience as a student leader was very difficult because of the prevailing sexism. People were saying, no, a woman cannot be president of a radical student organization, an activist organization. And so there was huge debates within the organization, and I just said, okay, goodbye. And I decided to go look for a job. I ended up working in a weekly magazine as a staff writer, and then became its associate editor, became its managing editor, and then decided to unionize the place. I was so young, I didn't realize that I was management, being managing editor. So I got fired, but the union was recognized. The union couldn't protect me because I was part of management. I went freelance, worked, wrote for many publications, and did script writing for television. Then martial law was declared by Ferdinand Marcos, and I was arrested and imprisoned for 6 months in a military detention camp. Then when I was released, I became a very dutiful, law-abiding citizen working in a quasi-government agency by day, but by night, I was involved in many things, raising money, taking some of the wounded to doctors, building a network of resources. And finally, my very close friend, Rose Galan, and I launched the first underground paper, which is still in existence up to now. It's called Liberation. So then one day I was told I was slated for a second arrest, which I did not like because they were filing cases before the military tribunal. And the tribunals did not ask for proof. So I felt like I couldn't defend myself. I should run. And I got to the United States on a writer's fellowship. And I thought I would stay for a year and cool off. I was on my way home when my mother called and said, "Do not come home. They're waiting for you at the airport." So I got stuck. Yes. And then I started to write for American publications. That's it.
Thank you so much. So you said that this underground paper Liberation is still alive, let's say, in the Philippines today? Okay.
Yeah.
Is it run by young people or just people from all different backgrounds? Who is it run by?
Run by the Communist Party of the Philippines.
Okay.
In those days, everybody was a member of the Communist Party, or most people were, because there was no alternative adversarial center.
Okay. Thank you so much for this introduction. A warrior since a very early age. I wanted to ask you because I've read an article of yours. I must admit, I don't remember the means of communication. But in this article, you referred to this concept that I found really interesting, which is the grooming into servitude of Filipino women when they are exported for labor purposes to the States and to Europe. And by labor purposes, I mean mostly domestic care and care work, but also sexual exploitation, such as prostitution. I was wondering if you could tell our European viewers more about the migratory journey of Filipino women to the Western states, let's say, and if the colonial past of the Philippines still affects. What role does it play exactly in the migratory journey of these women?
Well, we must know that the live-in household help in the Philippines used to be male. Yes, which is a mind-boggling when you think about it. The women were not allowed to take positions in-house, in-house domestics. This is a kind of practice where the poor families would send their sons to their rich relations, and the sons would act as a family servant, and in return he was sent to school. Some of our national heroes, the ones who led the revolution, managed to get schooling, managed to get educated that way. But when the Americans occupied the Philippines, that changed, probably because of one incident. I speculate here. But in the island of Samar, a group of American troops were celebrating and having dinner. And so they had these menfolk serving dinner. And the menfolk killed all of them while they were drinking and eating. The payback was really horrible, the retaliation. The American colonel in charge of the island ordered the killing of every male from the age of 10 up. Now, remember, these troops just came from the campaigns against those we call now Native Americans. And so they knew about the role of women in societies which are not European. There is a Kayin tribe saying that a nation cannot be conquered until the hearts of its women are on the ground. And so this was a lesson that was applied to the Philippines. Very slowly, the change in the status of women, there were some benefits and there were some disadvantages. The women were pushed into basically service professions, like the first female medical school graduate of Harvard was a Filipina, Dr. Fe Del Mundo. She was my pediatrician when I was a kid. Yeah. Very funny that these things are still within living memory. But so nursing, doctor, the healthcare work, and then of course the domestic work. And then in the 70s, when the war in Vietnam grew very large and very intense, they set up the Philippines as a rest and recreation center. And so the sex trade there mushroomed really huge, really. So you had dancing schools for those who were dancing in the bars and the nightclubs, and then some of the troops married Filipinas, and so you had this bride school run by Americans in the bases, where they taught the Filipina wives how to cook steak and American dishes and how to run a washing machine. Okay. So, but the first exports were women for the sex trade. Those were the first exports. So you can see there are several intertwining factors that set the profitability of women's labor for the Filipino consciousness. One was the sex trade, the second was tourism, and then finally the export of domestic workers. To this time, I think it has been interrupted by the pandemic. There are schools in the Philippines which train Filipinas on household work, how to run a Western kitchen and stuff like that, how to deal with your employer, how to please your employer. And so we now have this phenomenon of something like 12 million overseas Filipina workers. Things are not very good for them right now. A lot of them are in tourism in cruise ships. Yeah. So all the ships are like docked. There's no work. And then you have the Middle East, where a lot of Filipina domestic workers are. I think roughly around 35,000 have lost their jobs in Dubai, United Arab Emirates. So these jobs are not secure. They're not based in your home country. The host country or the recipient country can always throw you out. Even in the United States, for our healthcare workers, we had to fight for the right to stay. In the 1980s, they were brought to the United States as temp workers. And these were nurses and doctors and med techs and x-ray technicians, They could stay for 5 years and then they were sent home. And then they could reapply. They lost their seniority. If they're not hired, they lost all of their unemployment benefits, etc., etc. So we had to organize and fight for a permanent residency for them. Yeah, but it's still not enough. As you can see,
It's interesting.
go ahead.
Sorry. Go. I think it's interesting because, as you were mentioning before, the Bible and priestesses and their connection to water, yet it's very symbolically violent that these women were starting to get exported by sea, by the same water that represents kind of a symbolic to your people. I don't know if it was made on purpose, but I do think it's interesting from a symbolic point of view.
It's in the Bali culture. We were part of the Balinese Empire. Yes, in Bali, the water source is owned by women. Yeah, and she's the one who says who gets how much water from the source, for the fields.
Okay, thank you. You mentioned that you keep fighting, and even though it brings a lot of pain, I'm glad that you do. Speaking of fighting, I know that you are the founder of Affirm, which is, we said before, a U.S. Filipino organization for women. I was wondering if you could tell our viewers as well what is the organization like, what its mandates, what kinds of campaigns are. I know there's a campaign called Purple Campaign against the sex trafficking in women. So I was wondering if you could first tell us about that, but also if you could make kind of a comparison between the women's rights movement in the Philippines and the one that is based in the US, and if they have any similarities, any links, or even any oppositions.
Okay, there are two parts to our organizational history. The first part was we were in solidarity with the Philippine women's movement. We were then called GADMET. And even then, it was a multi-ethnic organization, even though it was in solidarity with the Philippine women's movement. At some point in our history, we decided that it was time to evolve. Our population, the population of women coming in from other countries into the United States, that population was growing. We had Portuguese, Brazilians, everybody. And there was no organization that could put them all together. And so we launched Affirm. We evolved into Affirm after 2 years of study. We studied very intensely. And 2 years of study resulted in Affirm. We just keep the name Filipino there because certain forces wanted to co-opt our history and pretend they were us. No, we are entitled to our history. So Affirm is an organization that practices transnational feminism because our members are drawn from what we call the 1.5 generation, meaning they were either brought here very young or they were born here of first generation Americans. And so the link to the ancestral land and the ancestral culture is very strong. We are kind of like, we chose the most difficult generation to organize because this is the generation that still is in search of identity and of being. So I'm crazy. I choose always the most difficult things to do. Right now, our Affirm, the national chair of Affirm, is a Vietnamese Chinese ethnic. Yeah. The National Executive Committee has Korean American from South Korea, Latinas, and of course Filipinas. And in the leadership of the whole organization, there's so many ethnicities represented. I have lost track because it's grown so far beyond my capacity to oversee it day by day. Um, but these are 1.5 generation, very young. The joke is, if I enter a meeting room, I immediately raise the age median, double. These are very young, in their late 20s, early 30s. Yeah. And very, very attuned to the experience of colonialism and the sex trade. This is why they fight so intensely, because it's not only that they are the ones recruited in the United States, because they don't know yet how to read the culture. And they are enticed by all of this, you can have bling, you can have this and that. And but at the same time, they're the ones who know the impact of the sex trade, in their own ancestral lands. So there is that. There is this complementarity of experience and knowledge that fuels the intensity of these very young women to oppose the sex trade. Yes. The
What
purpose.
kind of?
Go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead. Go ahead. No, go ahead,
The
please.
Rose campaign was originally launched in opposition to the sex trade in the Philippines. We have broadened that. It is now being carried by a lot of organizations. We just opened discussions with some organizations in Africa where the sex trade is pretty bad too.
I was wondering, what kind of opposition do you women run into when speaking so actively against the sex trade, especially in the U.S. Here in Europe, in the European Union, at least, it's sometimes very difficult to show publicly this kind of opposition. It can get you cancelled or deplatformed even, and you can have a lot of personal and political and social repercussions. So I was wondering, what kind of repercussions do you women run into, or do you have a strong opposition against your vision and your ideals at US level?
Oh, totally. Very strong. Our first engagement on this issue occurred when the largest socialist organization, socialist quote unquote, organization in the United States issued a resolution for the total decriminalization of the sex trade. And so we issued a rejoinder reminding them of the history of the sex trade in this very continent, in North America, that this thing was not known to the natives who lived here. And it was used as a weapon to conquer this land. And so this resonated with a lot of the indigenous and the native. The Hawaiians, for instance, supported us very strongly on this issue. And we came up with this slogan, land and women not for conquest. Because this is the first strategy of the colonizer and the occupier. As soon as you get control of a population's women, that's it. It's a gunner. And we know that. But right now we are undergoing very severe attacks, and we are unhappy about it because the sex trade is using one of the most marginalized population sectors to argue for a further oppression of that very sector. I'm talking about the transgender sector. This is a very difficult issue. But finally, out of nowhere, a trans woman came out and issued a statement supporting our position on the right to exit. Because in the discourse on legalization and decriminalization, we never speak about the right to exit. Now, from my point of view, this is the most denied right for women. You can't live a relationship which is abusive because the guy will kill you. You have no right to exit. And we had one case here where the singer was under contract. She wanted to break the contract because the producer, according to her, raped her. The court said she couldn't break the contract. She had no right to exit. So this goes on in matters from the very small, from the very individual to the largest. The right to leave is the most denied right to a woman. And I'm talking about women as a huge category. Yeah. So we were quite surprised that this argument of ours that you can decriminalize those who are bought and sold, but that has to be supported by programs that will enhance their right to exit. Because the sex trade is a trap. It feeds on all the vulnerabilities of a woman. Yeah. So we're currently undergoing attacks, but we have supporters.
Mm-hmm. And you have supporters here from the European countries, and especially those who adopted the equality or the Nordic model. So I wish you a lot of luck in that front, even though it's a very difficult one. As I was mentioning before, you were the press secretary in the Hague's International Tribunal for Japan's military slavery during World War II. And that same tribunal ultimately got Japan convicted of the creation and the use of what we now know as comfort women. Could you maybe, if you want, of course, elaborate a bit on your experience there? How did it influence you in your work against the sex trade today? And if you could elaborate a little bit on comfort women for the European viewers that may or may not be familiar with that Asian phenomenon or specificity. Sorry.
This was a policy of Japan's Imperial Army during the Second World War. The bulk of the women came from Korea. There was a campaign for women to volunteer. And according to the women, they had the impression that they were supposed to care for the wounded soldiers, to make bandages, etc., and things like that. That's why they were called to comfort the soldiers. It turned out they were slated for military prostitution. And so this practice was carried on to the various countries which Japan occupied, including the Philippines, Taiwan, Indonesia. There were several Dutch women who were used as comfort women. They were based in Indonesia at the time. But the thing was, there was a great deal of sexism also when it came to dealing with this war crime. When the comfort women of Asia started to demand an acknowledgement of their existence, they were told that things had been settled already under the whatever arrangements they made after the Second World War. But that only covered the Dutch women who were in Indonesia. So all of these women came about, and we decided to put together a women's tribunal and to run it very clean along international legal lines. And we had, a prosecutor, a defense. We had the women come in to testify. And for me, the most astonishing thing was both North and South Korea agreed to be represented as one country. That was pretty amazing. And then Taiwan and China came in as one country. That was also amazing. And then you had women coming out from very places we never even imagined there were comfort women, like Papua New Guinea, places like that. So listening to the testimonies, I remembered the stories my mother used to tell me when I was a kid, because they went through the Japanese occupation of the Philippines, that one of my aunts had to accept a lover because of the threat of being taken by the Japanese to its brothel houses. And my mother was like telling me, not telling me, I was a little kid listening, pretending to play with a doll, but listening. But all of the mixed races, the mestizas, who were in a certain area in Manila, were gathered up by the Japanese soldiers and taken to their brothel houses. And she was telling one of my relatives. Yeah, and so these stories had a personal resonance for me. So I was very impressed, and also the determination of the women to speak out after so many years of keeping the trauma inside. I was looking at them and I was thinking of how difficult it is to organize women in the sex trade because of this thing that we deal with trauma in a very private manner. It's very difficult to speak out when your body is concerned, is involved, yeah? So it was very good to hear these women, to see these women speak out. Yes.
Was it easy for these women? I imagine at the time, I admit I don't know the exact date of when this was, but how easy or difficult was for these women to to get from that side of the world into The Hague to speak up? Were there any kind of incentives to them besides collective remembering and maybe reparations for what had happened to them?
They wanted a judgment. They wanted a judgment. They wanted their experience on record. And they wanted a judgment. Yes, that was the main thing, that the world should recognize that this was done to them. Mm-hmm. And I must say that this whole thing was instrumental. One of the factors that went into the recognition of rape as a war crime by the International Criminal Court. Yes.
Okay, thank you for sharing your experience. Okay, my last and final questions, because I don't want to take too much of your time. And also a message to the viewers, if any of you would like to ask a question to Ninotchka, please feel free to write in the chat and we will address them in due time. But as my last question, I want to talk about another concept that I found very interesting of yours, which is a language of revolt. I was watching a video the other day of a recording of yours in 2018 from the Chicago Women in Media Conference, and you talked about the importance of creating a methodology in order to then create a language that is aligned with your struggle. So a language of revolt, as you say it. Could you expand a bit on that and explain to us?
Well, we express concepts in language. And right now we are using a language that is how would you say it, linear and binary. Okay. How can I explain to you what a babaylan is? There is no equivalent word for babaylan. Priestess is an approximation. Okay. Is there really a word to describe us, the new women? We are all evolving, and unfortunately, the language is not keeping up with us. You know, somebody once said to me, we can't even describe what we are at this time because we women are evolving so fast from the old concept of woman, you know. So there is that. How can I explain something like let me think of the Tai G2. This is the yin yang symbol. How can I explain that in a language that is linear, that does not understand layers, yeah, or connections of layers? It's very difficult. And then how do we explain to the world what we are in very clear terms? What we see the world should be in our perspective. How do we phrase it without using a masculinist language? This is one of the big problems. Affirm, for instance, is one of its 5 mandates is theory building, because we look at the theories developed in academia and we were very unhappy. We decided that we should try to build theory from our own experience and from the language that we use in shaping that experience and evaluating that experience. I'm sorry, I sound very abstract, but it is a major problem, really. How can I tell you about the five, well, genders? Gender is an approximation. The five roles of those who are male, female, or male, female, or female, male in my culture. How do I explain that? It's very difficult. So we are using a language that forces us to be binary at all times, and that is hard. That is hard.
I'm thinking
Yes.
in abolitionist circles here in Europe, for example, we don't use the term prostitute, for example. We use the concept of woman in prostitution. Would that be more or less what you're trying to refer to?
Some of those prostituted women, women in the sex trade, but these are still inadequate terms because they do not carry with them all the factors that go into making a woman enter the sex trade. You know, the coercion, for one, psychological, social, physical coercion that a woman has to undergo to make the decision to enter the sex trade. That's why this thing about the word choice. What is the word choice? What is the word agency? These are individual, westernized concepts. If you are a woman embedded in a family that is starving to death because the family has no money, what is the agency there? And I say this because I have encountered women in the sex trade who decided to enter the sex trade because of factors like that. So we had to find something else. I don't know. Then we do not have a word, for instance, for the men who patronizes the sex trade. We have euphemisms for him: client, John, punter. You know, we actually do not have, well, Spanish would have potero, which I like using.
Me too. I like that word as well. Yeah, but this poses also the question of co-opting language and changing it. For example, a childish example, but sex work, or I mean, how do you counteract with your theory building the co-opting of language, especially within the sex trade, but also maybe the whole sex versus gender debate and things like that.
Well, it's a continuing process. We discuss it and we study it. We right now we have a campaign. It's hashtag sex work is neither. Very simple, and we do study all the layers that go into creating something like the sex trade. And try to find a language for it. Language is very difficult.
Yes. Okay, thank you. I have some questions from the viewers. There's a question from Natasha. She said that you mentioned the evolution of women before. So her question is, how do you see it, the evolution of the concept of women or woman itself?
I don't know. I don't know where we're going right now. We are fighting for our right to exist. as we are, and our right to be what we will be in the future. So I'm Asian. Time is embedded in my language. Yeah, time. And so when we talk about the evolution of certain terms, it's an understanding of time is what we're looking for.
Okay. Natasha, I hope this answers your question. I cannot see any more questions now, but I wanted to tell the viewers that you can follow Affirm on social media. Jolene left you information on how to follow. And yeah, I was wondering, Ninotchka, do you have any final words before we end? Is there anything that you feel like you didn't say during this conversation that we had that you would like to address, or maybe you want to go in with your day? That's totally fine as well.
Yes. We do intersectional analysis. Okay. There are great differences in the lives of people of color and those who are not people of color to a certain extent, by and large. Okay. And there are very big distinctions between the lives of black women and white women, Latinas and Asian women. Okay, even Asian is too big a word. Yeah, because Asian is a huge diversity. That's why I started with I'm a Pacific Islander, because we tend to be lost in the category Asian. We're not. Asian is usually taken to mean East Asian. We're not East Asian. We may have some genes, but we're not culturally East Asian. Okay, so this just keep fighting and defining and redefining. It is a lost tradition, unfortunately. We used to have the women's language. Yeah. Japan, I think, still has a certain formulation of language that only women can use or can be used for women. But the practitioners of the women's language are like dying off. So it might be time to create a movement towards a new women's language. That's all.
Thank you so much, Ninotchka, and thank you so much for taking the time to speaking with us today. For me, it's personally an honor to be speaking with you today, and I really appreciate you taking the time and your good mood throughout the whole interview. So thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Have a great day. And good luck in New York with everything. Bye. Take care. Bye.